Well, we're certainly honored.
Speaking of nuts,
Yes, there you are.
comma,
Comma. Uh, we're so happy to have our current nut author, Jon Meacham, and I'm going to give the short version of whom you are.
please.
Executive editor and executive vice president of Random House, past editor of Newsweek magazine, now contributing editor of Time, and written many columns for the New York Times and other newspapers on boards, etc. I think that people know whom you are at this point. He's been the author of Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship, and won many prizes when it came out. American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers and the Making of a Nation, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, which won a Pulitzer in 2008. And we do, I think, have 2 or 3 actual first editions unused in stock right now.
I don't have any of those. I might buy them from you.
Well, all right. We'll hold them for Mr. Meacham then. His latest book is Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, by Random House. We always thank the publishers, so thank you for sending yourself. It's 739 pages illustrated and $35. Like your Jackson book, it's very well written and just reads fabulously and just takes the reader along. I also like, by the way, your new typeface called Requiem.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah, I don't know if this is like telling this to an editor is like telling a woman you like her shoes, but
No, you got, approvingly, yes. If you don't like the shoes, don't say anything.
I love Requiem. It's a nice.
I think that's the key thing. This was the typeface that I fell in love with it when I was reading Robert Massey's Catherine the Great.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same, and flipped back to the back and found it.
All right, and purloined it. Good thing to do. Well, I was reading the introduction, and I didn't get very far until my thought was, should this really be named the Thomas Jefferson Bookshop? So tell me why maybe it should.
Well, I think Thomas Jefferson was the most important politician of the early republic. He was the most successful, if we judge it by the gaining and keeping of power. From 1769 until 1809, he was virtually entirely always in public office or thinking about it. From 1800 to 1840, for 36 of those years, he was either in the White House or a self-described Jeffersonian was in the White House. One of the things that links my guy with your guy is Lincoln himself using Jefferson, reinterpreting Jefferson, particularly in 1859. Gettysburg, of course, we know, but in 1859, he was invited to give a Jefferson Day address and couldn't do it, wrote a letter from Springfield that said, all honor to Jefferson, to the man who had the coolness, forecast, and capacity. I always love that, this great blurb, coolness, forecast, and capacity, to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and at all times, this day and in all coming days. These words should be a very harbinger to the signs of reappearing tyranny and oppression, which is if you need to have an interpreter, that's a pretty good one to have.
Mm-hmm. There are other aspects of that link, by the way, Jefferson and Lincoln, besides this Declaration of Independence, and that is they were both good politicians.
Yep.
And both lawyers. How was Jefferson as a lawyer compared to maybe Lincoln?
Lincoln was a lawyer for a longer time.
Yes.
Jefferson read law with George Wythe, known as the father of American jurisprudence, very close to them. Wythe also gave him, I think, some very expensive tastes, had very good Madeira. Jefferson died in debt because of some of that Madeira. He tried some significant cases, lost an important case in this realm of race and race relations and the rights of African Americans and people of mixed backgrounds, that really, interestingly, I think, led him to his disenchantment with and attempts at emancipation, abolition, reforming slavery. And then he did very practical cases, like angry husbands coming after wives and wives going after angry husbands. So he rode circuit a good bit. And
how far was his circuit?
His world went from Monticello to Stanton, back down to Williamsburg, Richmond to Williamsburg. And he did it out of Shadwell, mainly. His mother's plantation. Shadwell burned in 1770-71, and that was when he really began in earnest to build Monticello itself.
Was he doing what Lincoln was doing out there? Was he politicking, becoming a politician?
Not really. My sense is that he was better trained for politics in Williamsburg itself. As a very young man, as a student at William and Mary, he stood at the door and listened to Patrick Henry orate against the Stamp Act. Jefferson said that Henry seemed to him to speak as Homer wrote, and he always admired that. He later, of course, wished that Henry was dead, but these things happen in politics. And so he learned the ways and means of the legislature there in Williamsburg. He learned from a cousin how to overturn a result. Henry had carried the day one day, and then mistakenly gone back to Louisa County a day early. So there was still one legislative day, and the opposing faction went in, rummaged around, and found a way to flip the result. And this made a great impression on the young Jefferson.
Should have come to Chicago.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Now, you with Jefferson, Ron Chernow, who was sitting in this chair before he won a Pulitzer, with Washington, David McCulloch with his John Adams, Ron White and others with Lincoln. Edmund Morris was also here for his Teddy Roosevelt. Every few generations need to reevaluate and redefine the founders and the presidents, as we seem to be doing in a bunch right now.
I think so, and I think Jefferson would approve of it. Jefferson thought we should throw out every law after 21 years, which was kind of a recipe for chaos. That was a letter to Madison. Madison played a very spousal role for Jefferson, in that when Jefferson would occasionally write a letter, show it to Madison, and ask him if he should send it. Now, if you have to ask, the answer is usually no, you shouldn't. So the writing to Madison in September of 1789, he said, the world belongs to the living. And he was in full revolutionary mode at that point in France. But I think to some extent biography and history is rather in the same zone as Jefferson's view of constitutions, which he said asking a country to live with a constitution created in its infancy is like asking a grown man to wear the coat he wore as a child. And so I do think that things change. And Arthur Schlesinger was Arthur ever sitting here?
No.
He would have loved it. Arthur is the only person who, when Arianna Huffington asked him to blog for the Huffington Post, he would fax in his blogs. He typed them. So I'm not really sure we could say that Arthur blogged.
It's a 19th century way of
It was. He used to quote a Dutch historian saying that the chief duty we owe to history is to rewrite it.
Does a president have to live in great times to be great himself? Clinton wanted to be, but didn't have a war.
Oh, I don't think that's true about Clinton.
I don't think so.
Actually, he's still out campaigning. No, I'm joking. He's out still campaigning right now. I don't know who's going to tell him we voted. Hey, man. I think that, yes, and in fact, President Clinton, as you allude, actually has made a study of two-term non-war presidents. Jefferson, Jackson, Grant, Eisenhower himself, and has a very clear sense that you have to look carefully at those presidencies because, as you know, the air you breathe here is about inherent drama. The moment Abraham Lincoln becomes president is a moment of inherent drama. And as Harry Truman once said, heroes know when to die. And so the way Lincoln left this mortal coil, is fairly dramatic. And so
I'm one of the few, I've said this before, I may as well say it right now, that I'm one of the few who was not totally unhappy with John Wilkes Booth. It wouldn't have been this Abraham Lincoln bookshop. It may have been a Thomas Jefferson bookshop instead.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that a whole heck of a lot. But we were among friends here.
Exactly.
So, and no one, don't worry about it. But to be killed if you have to be killed and your name is Abraham, and going down on Good Friday is not a bad way to do it. And so I think that there's that example in history. There's Washington to some extent. One-term presidents have a very hard time getting a great historical hearing. I think David's achievement with John Adams was wonderful in that way. ultimately I'm going to do a biography of George H.W. Bush that I hope can put that one term in proper perspective. So I think it helps, obviously, to have the clarifying drama of a war, but I always feel slightly dirty saying that, because that means that men had to die in order for us to be interested in something that happened. And people, and not to blame war presidents for war, but presidents who avoid armed conflict deserve equal attention and gratitude, it seems to me.
Man bites dog.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true.
And that's what
It's
that's
true.
what
No
sells.
traffic accidents today.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, Jefferson and Jackson. It's hard not to think about the two of them in tandem in some ways. How do you compare them, having written books on both of them? The characteristics they share or differ in?
If you think about the white America of the period roughly between 1740 and 1845 or so, actually that century, that's good, because that's the year Jefferson was born and the year Jackson died. 102 years separate those two things. You see, I think, that Jefferson began life at the very top of white society. Jackson began it at the bottom. Jefferson never had to struggle for anything, really. Jackson was an utterly self-made man. I could never really prove that Jackson spent any substantial time in an academic setting. Jefferson was formed by two great tutors, by wonderful teachers in Williamsburg, by George Wythe, whom I mentioned, by William Small, who was his professor of philosophy, by Francis Fauquier, the governor, by Peyton Randolph politically. He just had mentor upon mentor and went from strength to strength in a way that Jackson could only have dreamt of. Jackson, I suppose he read law. There's a wonderful story about a house he had boarded in Salisbury, North Carolina, and a biographer came in shortly after when he was running for president, and he asked the landlady, can you tell us what Andrew Jackson was like before he ran for president? And she said, Andy Jackson's running for president? So no one would ever have said, Thomas Jefferson's running for president? So he was totally self-educated. And the most substantial thing in Andrew Jackson's educational life was the years he spent in the Waxhaw Meeting House, Presbyterian Meeting House, hours and hours of the Shorter Westminster Catechism, of the Bible. His rhetoric is very much studded with biblical references. He once was so angry, I'm trying to remember, I think it must have been Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun, all of whom he hated like Jesus hates sin. He got so angry he was confused. He said, there shall be a fate that shall come to this Judas that will be like Absalom, and it just goes on with a bunch of biblical characters, none of which made any sense together. But his fury was such that that's where his mind went. Jefferson, much cooler. The other thing I've realized is that I should have saved Jackson for my retirement, because whenever he got mad, he shot someone, and Jefferson wrote a letter. So Jackson was easier to dramatize.
I'm just going to show, I'll ask another couple of questions on their relationship or ties that they may have. At the top is a note by Andrew Jackson in 1813 as Major General, and the bottom Jefferson introducing someone. It's not the nicest Jefferson have ever had, but at least it's a beautiful signature, and you can see how they write. Native Americans.
Can I say quickly?
Please.
Actually, when you compare those two things, it rather supports the point I was trying to make. Jackson's handwriting was bold, not that many words per line, raced across the page. Jefferson has very elegant, very tidy, very almost fussy handwriting. And it's a case of boldness and energy and a kind of unbridled ambition in public life, an expression of oneself, as opposed to a very cool, intellectual, enlightenment-driven ethos and persona.
This signature does not really show what Jackson was, the expansiveness, as you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a land grant out there that he signed, and he signed quite a number,
Yep.
that he wasn't surprised when the end of the paper came.
Exactly.
And that SON is always just
Right.
in there.
Right.
It just goes, and then all of a sudden, there it
Right.
is.
Right.
So, and all that is. So they also each had something to do with Native Americans.
Yeah.
Were Jefferson's
Nothing
attitudes, exactly, were their attitudes, Jefferson's attitudes toward Native Americans closer to Jackson than most people might think? I mean,
Absolutely.
the removal issue, although Jefferson was maybe more for assimilation? Yes, no?
No, they were both wrong, and they were both in the mainstream, and the mainstream was wrong. Jefferson is often quoted slightly out of context about a military situation where he says, "We will never have peace until we have killed everyone on the side of the Mississippi." That was a more particular remark than a general statement. But the only person who comes out of the question of Native Americans well, it seems to me, is Henry Knox, who did have a fairly humane plan, totally went nowhere, and Washington, Adams, Jefferson all set in motion the tragedy that culminated in the Trail of Tears and in the ongoing white land grabs. There was kind of tragic inevitability to this, where white greed was going to trump everything. And one of the things a point I make about President Jackson in this is, yes, he sinned mightily in this case, but there was only one great legislative fight over removal, and that was in 1830. It was a very hard-fought vote, and no one ever brought it back up again. So I think we can wag our finger at the past, but again, to quote Arthur, self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap.
We'll get back to some of this. Again, with Jackson and Jefferson, an issue that linked them is when Jefferson wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions,
Right.
which really was the basis of something we're akin to here, the states' rights,
Right.
and also the nullification crisis in Jackson's time led to that as well.
Yeah, Jackson's finest hour, in my view. I was in an airport the other day, quickly, and a man was coming off an airplane, and he had a T-shirt with a silhouette of Texas and the word "secede," and I couldn't tell which side he was on. Was it a command or a cry? I didn't ask him. I was afraid of the answer. Nullification was Jackson's finest hour, because the natural implications, the natural conclusion of his philosophy actually would have put him closer to Calhoun than to Webster, if you really played it out. And that would have supported nullification and ultimately, by implication, the right of secession. My argument in American Lion was that Jackson, for emotional reasons, believed so deeply in the American Union, that we were one great family, that we could fight as much as we wanted. We could throw wild turkey bottles at each other, we could break furniture, but we were going to stay in the same house, by God. And the passion of the declaration of the 10th of December, 1832, which he issued to the people of South Carolina, calling them home. He wrote it so fast, speaking of this, so fast, standing in what is the Lincoln bedroom now. The pages were falling off his desk, and Andrew Donaldson was coming in, taking them up, and running across to Livingston to get them sort of tidied up a bit. But that passion about union was such that it defined him, and I think made him a great president. Jefferson did author, he and Madison, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that did make the case really for nullification.
Did Jackson reference Jefferson at all?
He had helped. Madison helped. I'm going to use a very technical historical term here. Madison walked the cat back. He walked it back in the 1830s, saying, "Oh, we never meant that." You did, but there we are. So Jackson didn't, but the nullifiers did. The nullifiers said, even the great Jefferson, even the great Madison. And intellectually, sure. I mean, let's be honest. If you're a lawyer reading this, that's a natural result. but politics isn't law, and so statecraft certainly isn't legalism. So Jefferson's anger in that moment and upset and the impetus for those resolutions were the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he believed was a step to monarchy and an end of the republic. And the key factor about Thomas Jefferson that I return to again and again in the book is, short of the existence of the American experiment, he would cut almost any deal. But he believed fundamentally that the American Revolution and its definition, its interpretation, and its applications was so important that he would break almost any philosophical tenet in order to guarantee the survival and success of the country. And
Well,
but that's what linked him and Adams through all their storm and strife.
some call him then a hypocrite for that. I'm looking at Paul Finkelman, who lashed out at Jefferson in an op-ed piece this last week, the New York Times, calling him a creepy, brutal hypocrite. Wrote the Declaration of Independence,
No,
but
that's
held
perfect.
slaves. Promoted small government, but pushed presidential powers. Disliked establishment institutions. It's not all Finkelton and coming out
Yeah,
of
sure.
Finkelman, but liked the military. But he still helped found West Point. So you're really saying that part of this quote unquote alleged hypocrisy is really a pragmatism, and that when one gets to a certain position, one needs to do what one needs to do.
Yeah, you've noticed the man behind you.
I have.
So we can start there with habeas corpus and other things. Of course he's a hypocrite. He's a human being. And of course he changed his mind and was inconsistent. He was a political leader trying to put together coalitions of opinion to resolve specific problems for a specific period of time under the constraints of history. I wish life in politics could be wonderfully consistent, and that one could articulate a principle, be elected on it, and then absolutely stick by it no matter what. I can't think of a successful American president who's done that. Circumstances change, people change. Politics is contingent. That's what it is. One of the reasons I did this book is I thought that Jefferson's political life was a part of his legacy and his historical reputation that had not been looked at in a way, aside from trying to call him a hypocrite, in quite a while. I mean, if you want, wonderful books have been written about all the people around Jefferson, and Jefferson hasn't come out of them very well. But my view is that's the price of politics. He was trying to, as best he could, through what George Eliot called dim lights and tangled circumstance, trying to secure the American Revolution. And he believed that it was an epoch in human affairs, that it was the political expression and political manifestation of Enlightenment ideas about individual destiny and individual responsibility and individual liberty. And without those things, a republic could not survive. The life of the mind and the life of the republic were inextricably intertwined, because if you couldn't think for yourself, a king or a despot would step in to think for you. That's what he was devoted to. And he crossed people, and he was duplicitous, and he lied. But let's go down the list if we want to start playing moral arbiter among presidents. And yes, he was a hypocrite on slavery. His tragedy was the American tragedy. But again, simply denouncing Jefferson seems to me to be not particularly useful. Does that mean we just don't talk about him? I mean, does it mean you don't attempt to learn from him because of this hypocrisy? I don't quite see what the point of that is. My view of this is we don't learn as much if we are looking up at someone uncritically or down on them snobbishly as we do when we look them in the eye. And what I tried to do here was look him in the eye.
Before we get off the slavery issue, I want to ask you one thing about how each Jackson again and Jefferson, because the Jackson letter is up at sale, I see, which is kind of interesting. Writing in as president, September of 1833, Jackson writes to his son, Junior, and says that Major Donaldson had returned last night from his report. I think it will be well for you to visit Hermitage as early as your convenience, and the season will permit. The Major says, 2 of our young Negroes died whilst he was there. Jackson, of course, was in Washington, but does not know their ages and names. That Lindy and Alabama Sally were sick, and Hannah, Dick's eldest daughter, was still confined with her hip. He says that the Negroes appear as though they were entirely abandoned by their owners, that's him, and in a state of despair. These considerations will make it necessary, as I cannot go, that you should, and remain at least a while to encourage and convince them that we are constantly watching over them, and their good treatment, and will not permit them to be ill-treated or misused. Here is Jackson. How was Jefferson vis-a-vis the slave population that he had?
Well, that's a subject of some discussion at the moment, as you know.
And I keep hearing you talk about it, but I'd like to ask you about this.
Sure. I don't think there's such a thing as a good slave master. I mean, maybe I'm being overly reductionist about that, but I don't think that letter is solicitous. But we're talking about Andrew Jackson being solicitous about people he owned and whose freedom he controlled. So it doesn't quite track for me. I think that differences of degree may be important, but that the whole question of kind is such that trying to make distinctions, give a gold star to this slave owner and a bad grade to this one, strikes me as odd. It's all bad. They should all stand convicted, as they do, I think, before the bar of history, and that we then look at their legacies whole in order to, in my view, not feel morally superior to them, but to sharpen our own moral antenna, and to mix metaphors, and raise our own consciousness about problems of our own era where there is a moral case being made against a certain aspect of public or cultural policy which is not being changed because a majority of the mainstream of politically active people have economic, political, and cultural reasons of convenience not to change it. And you can, I urge everyone to make a list of what those issues might be. To my mind, climate change is there, economic inequality is there. There is much to be done. And there was much to be done in real time for Jefferson and Jackson and that generation in slavery, and it didn't get done. It didn't get done until your man came along 35 years after Jefferson died, and 600,000 casualties to adjudicate that. And in my native region, it took another century for us to allow people to vote.
Spielberg's movie out, and your book, and speaking a bit about compromise and maybe the necessity for it, maybe it is. But then again, thinking about my guy, and yours to some extent too, aren't there moments where one has to stick to principle?
Totally.
And if it wasn't for Lincoln sticking to the principle of no extension of slavery into the territories and sticking to it and not compromising on it so that maybe there wouldn't be secession, who knows where we'd be right now. But how do we know in any particular moment, like right this moment, who is more correct? Those who we have to compromise or those who are sticking to principle?
Well, historically, winners write history, so there's that. But Lincoln, the first inaugural is a masterful document about practical politics, right?
Who's first inaugural? You loved.
Oh, sorry,
Jefferson's first inaugural.
Lincoln. Well, both actually. Jefferson's was more hopeful. Lincoln's was fairly tough, right? And he did not come in. Lincoln did not come into office without an appreciation that 60% of the country was totally fine with leaving slavery as it was. Right? He didn't run on an emancipation platform.
Wouldn't have been elected.
Right. So, And if things had gone differently during the war, would he have issued the Emancipation Proclamation when he did? I don't think so. So his principle, which was to preserve the Union and try to do the best he could about slavery, which would be my very shorthand way of articulating Lincoln's principled view. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
My view is with Jefferson is that he was desperate to ensure the survival and success of the Republic. And short of that, and he feared, absolutely feared, the return of monarchy, of a hereditary Senate, of hereditary power. And even George Washington thought he was wrong and was overly paranoid. As President Nixon taught us, even paranoids have enemies. And
my notes, by the way.
It's a easy argument to win because Jefferson was vindicated in 1812 when they did come back. So how wrong?
But is that part of policy as well? I mean, we were still fighting to some extent Britain, and one of the reasons they came back is because we were still fighting them on the seas. And the Embargo Act, for instance,
Sure.
is something that was not the best time for Jefferson's second term.
It wasn't, but
and helped lead to that.
it did. But there are worse things
1812.
than buying a year of peace, particularly in that era, right? I'm gentler about the embargo than a lot of people because every time he talked about the embargo, he talked about preparations for war, and every time he talked about the embargo, he talked about the inevitability of war. So he was not some dreamy philosopher here. And the embargo was the greatest extension of executive power, arguably in American history. So, he used Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends.
Yeah, I didn't expect when he got into power, as it were, he didn't overturn Hamiltonianism.
No, and Hamilton suspected he wouldn't, interestingly. Remember, Hamilton, I guess it's interesting, the only person who could make Hamilton like Jefferson was Burr, which, as things turned out, he was right. I like to say that my guy, at least Hamiltonians, at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. So we have that going for us. I think that the embargo, I think the extension of power, the issues of trying to position the executive at the center of the national drama were all things that Jefferson would not have wanted to articulate in those terms, but it is what he practically accomplished. And Hamilton, in 1801, during the dispute of the presidency, said that Jefferson, because he craves popularity, will be less likely to tear things up than we think. John Marshall starts a letter on the morning of the inauguration, March 4th, 1801, saying that Republicans are divided between Democrats and terrorists. And then he hears Jefferson's inaugural and comes back and finishes the letter saying it was much more temperate in tone than I would have expected. And that inaugural did have an extraordinary effect. Benjamin Rush actually wrote that he had seen joy on people's faces when they realized that perhaps differences of opinion were not differences of principle.
I'm going to take a little bit of a turn here into a different hat for you for a moment, and we'll return in this hat to Jefferson as well. But here is my favorite Lincoln book, which does not have Lincoln in it, called Lincoln's Doctor's Dog. George Stevens, who had been the head of W.W. Norton Publishing, had spoken about how bestsellers are made. Very few are made by advertising alone, but they're produced in some way. So he's talking about Anthony Adverse and Moby Dick and others, and because this is Lincoln's Doctor's Dog and other bestsellers. He always said the only books that sell are books about dogs, books about doctors, and books about Lincoln.
Right.
So Lincoln's Doctor's Dog.
What
are your thoughts?
Interrupt just real quickly. I used in the 90s and early part of the 21st century, when news magazines were still more central to the conversation, I used to think that a combination of all the words that worked well on covers on newsstands would lead us to the new science of a gay Jesus, plus what he means for your health. So it's the same. Okay.
and how it impacts the Jewish problem as well.
There you go. Plus.
Yeah, plus. So, your thoughts on bestsellers,
Mm-hmm.
and from your perspective, are they made, basically, even though there's some that advertise themselves out there?
Define made.
Well, they have to be marketed correctly and
Right.
used correctly in the common wheel so that it's not just advertising, but maybe you're being here.
Yeah, my sense is you can start strong. That, and by advertising, I would argue that what we mean television interviews, radio interview, media,
Mhm.
if we can call it that, as opposed to paid advertising. I don't think paid advertising does much, but media exposure, you can get a great start. You can get a great first week. But if the book's not good, or if people don't like it, I should say, then you see this all the time, I'm sure. Then there's just this precipitous fall.
Of course, today with social media, etc., I mean, you can't get to the second page without telling someone what you're thinking of the first
No,
page.
there's no paucity of opinion.
No.
Uh,
and at this time, it wasn't. They didn't have the same
Right.
sort of medium.
Right. And so I actually always, this is my fourth book, I always worry, in a way, more about the second, third, and fourth weeks, and watch those numbers as closely as the first week, because that means that people who may have caught a television appearance, caught a radio interview, gotten the book, had a chance to go through it, either they are saying to someone, hey, you got to take a look at this, and that is reflected in the numbers, or you got it wasn't that engaging, and you're just not talking about it. Mm-hmm. So you can create the possibility of word of mouth, but you can't guarantee the result, is my experience.
So, just in general and kind of briefly, good luck. The future of the book trade. Do you see it?
Wait, I can do that quick.
All right. Going downhill that fast?
Mr. Gutenberg.
Well, I tell people that I feel like a monk.
Yeah.
Because
I know exactly.
Gutenberg came out and the monks were gone.
Your illuminated manuscripts.
That's it.
I totally understand that. This is as significant a period as the fallout from Gutenberg, unquestionably. We are at the beginning of it, so we can't know, really. I don't even think, to evoke Churchill, I don't even think we're at the end of the beginning quite yet. So what has been marvelous about the last 3 weeks, aside from the fact that I haven't slept, is the fact that at 4 o'clock people are here, that we're talking about this. I was in St. Louis yesterday, had a marvelous day and a half. People care about ideas. People care about history. There's a very particular kind of, that's the other thing we have to do, is we have to make distinctions. It's like talking about the media is liberal. Well, what do you mean? Do you mean the New York Times, or do you mean, Fox? So my particular focus is not, say, mystery readers, though I read them. I am one, but I don't know how that works in a business sense. I do have a better sense of how nonfiction works in a business sense. And what has been fascinating, and the reason this book, if I may compliment my Random House colleagues, and I can say this because I had nothing to do with it, it kind of doesn't matter what this book says because it's so pretty. It's really well done.
There it is.
And I didn't do it.
Jacket.
I didn't do it. Gina Centrello, the publisher of Random House, did all that.
And good illustrations inside there too, by the way.
Yeah, I drew some of them. You should see my trumbles.
We'll see them at Christie's, I'm sure.
That's right. There's a reason for that, because the question is, what is the durability of the market for the kinds of books that you want to keep here and sell? And is in fact nonfiction and history, biography, the more likely genre to keep these shelves stocked decades down the road, as opposed to fiction, mystery, thriller, literary fiction? And the early numbers suggest that those genres have more substantially moved to the digital world than nonfiction has. I don't know exactly what the split's going to be yet, but and I'll come back and tell you when I know. But I have a feeling it's going to be skew much higher on the physical side for this, because this kind of reader wants to keep the book.
Well, that's why virtual book signing exists, because there are enough people out there and in all sorts of markets that wish to gain a first edition signed, if they can get it, library that they can use, hold, enjoy, and be physically attached to history. I told the story before too about when I first came in the business, and a middle-aged black gentleman used to come into the shop. This is now 71, 72. And he was interested in FDR and purchased books on FDR. The second time he came in, I learned he didn't read. But he wanted to surround himself with a man who was mythological to him.
Fascinating.
And I think people in history do like to connect themselves physically with a letter or document like we just showed of Jackson and Jefferson, or a book that's a first edition from the 1830s, or what's coming up to auction tomorrow. Notes on the state of Virginia, one of only 200 copies that they're saying 150 to 250,000. So people do wish to have it. I think you might be onto something there.
And I think it is. I think it will last more with history, with all respect and love and awe and regard for my fiction colleagues. I just think that's a little trickier because of that historical tactile connection.
Yeah, the first edition with dust jacket of Faulkner is something
Sure.
people still want.
Sure.
Sometimes
They won't
history-
actually read it, by the way.
Well, if you can't read the paperback.
I one of my tests for people is if they say they like Faulkner, I just think they're probably dissembling. And I'm a Southerner, and I can't understand it.
History, Jefferson led to books, and that is the burning of them. So did the embargo lead to the war that led to the sacking of Washington? I'm just asking. But nonetheless, they burned the Library of Congress.
Yep.
And Jefferson sold his 6,000 plus library.
By the way, no, the embargo did not lead to the war.
Okay.
Just FYI.
That the
You Lincoln guys.
I know, we
Very
are.
tough on everybody else.
Yes, we are.
You know, and just so you know,
Yes.
there were some folks who created the Union that you saved. You can't be a hero without something to rescue.
Very true. We couldn't have had a war without the Confederates, too. So we understand that here. So he sold it for 23,000 plus to the country, and he had 3 libraries in his life.
He did. He inherited his father's, which is fascinating. There's a wonderful monograph on Jefferson's books by Monticello.
Yes.
And he grew up with Shakespeare, The Spectator, had some books of discovery, Ogilvy. So there were maps, there was a transport. Books for him did what books do for us, which is they transported him as a young man. So he built a library. It burned when Shadwell burned, which was crushing to him. The letters about this are quite emotional, and a reminder in a climate, well, we're in Chicago, so you understand fire, how elemental and terrifying that was, and how eviscerating. And he was eviscerated by that fire. He lost his case notes for riding circuit and was terrified that the judges would find him ill-prepared. I mean, there's very powerful letters in the first volume of the Princeton Papers. Then he built the second library, which is the one he sold in 1815 or so. But then he couldn't help himself, so he built another one. And, we just found 4 or 5 of them at Washington University that had come from a Coolidge relative down. It's fun to hold those.
Yes, they are.
I think it's not an original, but I think one of the most interesting books of Jefferson's, so to speak, is the Smithsonian edition of the Jefferson Bible from a couple of years ago, which is quite beautiful. And, it's interesting. He wrote, for all the letters, for all his eloquence, the book that's coming up to auction is, in fact, the only book he ever published. So he published 1 book.
Get off that for a moment. Jefferson's dynasty, you speak about that in the book, and you say it's unmatched in American history. Will you explain what that is?
Well, from 1800 to 1840, for 36 of those years, either Thomas Jefferson himself or a self-described Jeffersonian was president of the United States. And nobody else did that. Washington didn't do it, obviously, because Jefferson was undoing that. Jackson didn't do it. Lincoln didn't do it. TR didn't do it. FDR didn't do it. And Reagan hasn't done it. And so there is some measure of power, it seems to me, illustrated in the fact that as late as 1840, people were saying, I am a Jeffersonian Republican, or Jeffersonian Democrat, depending on the era, and therefore you should give me ultimate power. You know who has it's interesting, who has the chance of this, interestingly, is President Clinton. Because clearly President Obama, whether he would admit it or not, and he would not, so strike the weather, ran as a Clinton Democrat for re-election, which is a wonderful historical irony, given that he defeated a Clinton for the Democratic nomination. But when he essentially outsourced the argument for his re-election to Bill Clinton, it was a remarkable moment and an affirmation of the remarkable political transformation that President Clinton presided over in the Democratic Party between 1985 and 2000. When 1985 and the Democratic Leadership Council came into being through his election, through his 2 terms. So we should all stay tuned. It's possible, will it be possible that in 12 years, people will be saying, I want to return to the prosperity of the 90s still. And it's not inconceivable.
Bringing up Hillary.
And which Clinton, we don't know.
So Obama defeated one Clinton, but this is off subject entirely. Do you think that Hillary would hew to Bill's policies and thoughts, or she has her own that she might?
Have you ever met Senator Clinton?
I've not.
Then you wouldn't ask. She's got her own. She's got her own.
That's what I hope to hear.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. She's a formidable figure, and proved it with the Senate race in New York. Was a very. I think one of the things I admire most about her is her capacity to put her head down and learn the Senate, avoiding the national press in those first years of the Bush administration after she became a senator. And then the way she reacted to defeat in the Iowa caucuses in 2008, to my mind, was a great lesson in grace and resilience and grit. And those are good qualities in a president. I will confess to a bias on very much wanting Secretary Clinton to run as the father of young daughters. I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and the iconography of a woman being a strong contender, nominee, possibly a president, is so important. I think we've seen what that has meant with President Obama, and I think that the fact that my girls might grow up with Senator Clinton at the highest levels of government will have a remarkable effect on their lives.
Well, I don't think it's outside the pale, and even though she has to say one thing at the moment, it has to at least be on her mind, I would think.
Well, can I just, to bring us back to Jefferson, I don't know if this sounds familiar, but in 1792, you have a Secretary of State who leaves office at the beginning of a second term to return to rest because he's tired, with possibly an eye on the next presidential election. So Jefferson did exactly that, and that's what Secretary Clinton's doing.
Well, sure, that's why she's getting out now. She has to separate a bit.
John Adams said that it's remarkable how well political plants grow in the shade.
So talking about both of our guys, we know that the political world has to get right with Lincoln. Do you envision a time getting right with Jefferson then?
Oh, again, I'm sorry. I feel like we're the two guys in the Muppet balcony. My guy, your guy. But you had to get right with Jefferson first. James Parton wrote that if America is right, then Jefferson is right. If Jefferson was wrong, then America is wrong. They don't even say that about Lincoln, interestingly. I mean, maybe after Daniel Day-Lewis they will, but Jefferson has a much more complicated legacy than Lincoln, for all the obvious reasons. Jefferson, whether he would have or not, he never redeemed himself on race, and in fact actively moved against that, and therefore cannot in any way match Lincoln's greatness on that scale. My view of history is that there is a line between these two men, that one laid out a vision of human liberty, offered a promise, what Dr. King ultimately called the promissory note, and that Lincoln brilliantly and essentially reinterpreted and reapplied Jefferson in order to save the Union. You know, it's very interesting. Remember, you all know this. 7 years ago wasn't back to the Constitution. It was back to the Declaration. That's a critical thing. And so there is, I don't want to be too Whiggish about this, but there is an unfolding story. And that's what you want from history, I think. We want to build on each generation and correct the flaws where we can.
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation also was just a promise. You still have to fight for it.
True.
Coming back to something we were briefly on before, that as Ronald Reagan said of him, that during the Revolution he was an architect for disorder.
Right.
So did he, out there, many people feel that Jefferson wished to have or thought we should have a revolution every 20, 30 years.
Right.
Is that apocryphal, like Lincoln writing the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope?
It's not that apocryphal, but it's in the same zip code. It's I think it's a literal-minded reading of high-flown flights of rhetoric, and no one wrote better than Jefferson, and that has preserved his legacy. And it's one of the reasons we're here at this hour talking about him. It's also one of the reasons he's misinterpreted. Remember, as we know, letters in that era were like other people's phone calls. So it's there forever. And would you want everything you said thrown back? That's the most benign interpretation. I think the true interpretation, to my mind, the most plausible, is that he believed so strongly, to go back to this, in the need to fight monarchical and hereditary authority, that he talked about revolution, he talked about change, because if you put yourself in his shoes, the conversation, the tone of Washington, Adams, and Hamilton was about permanence and about the wisdom of the fathers and a seeming potential lack of change or a resistance to change. Jefferson wanted the country to always be ready to react to changing data and new discoveries. It's part of what links Lewis and Clark and his intellectual interest with his political interests. Because, again, if reason is to govern human affairs as much as possible, then you have to have an intellectually curious populace. And so the art of citizenship was something that Jefferson understood and knew required education, constant enlightenment, new information. And so all of that is linked in this.
We certainly need that in spades today.
Well, we need, yes. I think we need, we can't rip these guys out of context and say, what would Jefferson do about the fiscal cliff?
No.
That doesn't work.
I'm just talking about political life in general.
But there is a spirit.
They just need an educated populace, and they have to not ask politicians to teach them. They have to go out and learn as well.
Right. That's right. There's a wonderful line of Jefferson's late in his life that men are participators in politics not at election day only, but every day. And if they are, then they would rather have their heart ripped from their body than submit to a Caesar or a Bonaparte. And that's a wonderful kind of way of thinking about citizenship, I think. And, you know, he said things that seem beyond radical. But what did he do? You know, this is the man who doubled the size of the country and rejected the idea of a constitutional amendment the moment he found that it would be inconvenient.
Yeah.
And what I think of as his Claude Rains moment. He was shocked that anyone would think that he needed a constitutional amendment.
I'm going to put you to work for a few moments,
Sure.
signing if you would for us.